Man, I feel like a coffee. Better get some water and fill the kettle up.
What did you do to my kettle?
Run it over with the tractor.
Fix that. There's a lot of shit everywhere.
So I rewired my entire caravan and pulled out a perfectly serviceable inverter that was in the caravan when I bought it, and I replaced it with a different one. And I did all of this just so I could make a decent cup of coffee. And that sounds a little bit mad, but you wouldn't think it with Australians, but Australians are kind of, well, we're coffee snobs. Well, some of us are anyway. There are some of us out there that like to go camping with a flint in their pocket, a bit of dryer fluff, and get some instant coffee out of a jar, which I think's mud, and then put that into a billy, fill it with some ash from the fire, and they reckon that's fantastic. But after I've had a few cold cans around the campfire, there's nothing quite like waking up in the morning and having a decent cup of coffee. So let's have a look at what I did. Now, the inverter is actually the same size as the one that was in the caravan. The original inverter was a 2000 watt modified sine wave inverter. And what that means is essentially it's a square wave inverter. Now, AC power is supposed to be a nice, beautiful sine wave going from one pole to the other, unlike DC, which is just a straight negative and positive. Now, the advantages of AC, without getting into too much detail, is that it kind of travels further with less voltage drop, especially at higher voltages like 240 volts, which is what we use mainly in Australia. Now, the problem with square wave inverters and modified square wave, which kind of the same. Modified square wave are slightly better, but essentially it's the same sort of thing, is that they don't run sensitive electronics very well. They can do resistive loads quite well, so say a bar heater or a kettle, but when you start trying to run anything with electronics in it or switch mode power supplies, they tend to be fairly inefficient. And it turns out that my coffee machine, even though it looks very simple, actually has some electronics in it. And that meant that it would not work off my modified sine wave inverter. Not only that, I tend to make the odd YouTube video, so I like having the ability to charge laptops and camera gear that don't have low voltage chargers from the power points in the caravan. And if you've watched some of my videos before, you know I don't particularly like caravan parks, so having my own source of power is very handy indeed. Now, I do have a pure sine wave inverter in the Land Cruiser, but it's only 600 watts. So even though it'll run laptop and camera chargers, it's not enough to run a coffee machine. Most pod coffee machines start around 1200 watts and run up anywhere to 1700 watts. And that's certainly not going to cut the mustard with a 600 watt inverter. Now, I really like projector gear, and in the caravan it's got a projector, a 25 amp lithium charger, and it's also got a projected DC to DC charger, which I use from the Anderson plug from the Land Cruiser and also from the solar panels on the roof. And even though I've had projector inverters before, once we get into the 2000 watt range, they start to get very expensive, and there's only so much that I was willing to spend on making a decent cup of coffee. So I did a lot of research and I found this brand on Amazon that actually seems to be pretty reasonable. It had some very good reviews, people pulling them apart, showing what was inside of them. And so I ordered one of those up, and it was only around $250, $260 Australian. The only problem that I had was I had to try and get the power from the inverter to the kitchen, and the kitchen's outside. Now I just thought I'd simply tap into the wiring for the kitchen outlet and I'd just run that to the inverter, and I'm not going to run anything in the kitchen that needs to run off mains power anyway. That was my original idea, but it didn't work. And that's because the person who installed the air conditioner in the caravan before I purchased it tapped into the wiring from the kitchen power point, and it's actually a right pain in the neck to get to. It runs all the way through every single cabinet in the kitchen, underneath the caravan, the entire way around and back up to the main switchboard. So I came up with a different idea. I decided instead to use a generator changeover switch, and this actually turned out to be a way better way to do it, because what it meant was I could run all of the power points in the caravan directly off the inverter, and then I could just switch it over and run all of the power points directly off mains if I was at home or in a caravan park. This is really important because if I want to run the air conditioner, I can run it off the inverter, but not for very long periods of time. So if it's a 40-degree day and I'm camped in a caravan park, I can run the air conditioner as much as I like. It also means that the power points right next to the bed can be used for charging laptops and other gear while I'm off grid. I haven't done any testing on the air conditioner other than turning it on for a brief moment to make sure it works. On paper it uses around 1600 watts, so it's a 2000 watt inverter. It does run it, but at 1600 watts you're using nearly 150 amps, and that's a fairly big continual load to be running off 2 lithium batteries. So we're going to do a bit of testing on that in a later video and show you a little bit about that. I'm hoping that because it's an IBIS 4 Dometic, it's an inverter air conditioner, and if I have the fan down, maybe it won't quite draw that much, but that's something that we're going to look into a little bit later on in another video. So the first thing that I had to do was physically replace the inverter, and that was easy. I thought I'm going to try it out with the existing wiring that was from the factory, and it didn't work. Well, it did a little bit. It worked for a little while, about half a cup of coffee, before the inverter tripped out due to low voltage. And that's not because the batteries were going flat, that's because the voltage drop across the existing cabling was just too much. It was quite terrible, in fact. Now, the existing cabling wasn't too bad. It's a fairly short run from the battery to the inverter, but the cabling was about 6 gauge, and that's kind of a bit light on to be running 150 amps continuously. Now, I don't know what the quality of these batteries are. They were in the camper, and to be honest, they don't look fantastic. They have been working okay so far, but I was a little bit dubious about what sort of battery management system would be inside of these batteries and how they would go with that sort of current draw. So what I've done to try and mitigate this, even though it does have a 2 gauge joining cable or balance cable between the 2 batteries, I decided to run a bit of 4 gauge to each battery, and that way the BMS in one battery isn't going to be taking more load than the other while the batteries try and balance. Now, this may be a complete waste of time, and it may be unnecessary, and there might be some auto electricians out there that really want to give me a hard time over this, but there was another reason why I did that too. And that's because the original caravan came with a 200 amp Chinese circuit breaker. Now, we see these types of circuit breakers everywhere, and I've used them a lot in the past as well. But my brother's actually done some testing on some of these, and he found that sometimes they don't even trip out on a dead short. So under my bed, running large loads with thick cable, I kind of wanted something I could trust. So I've gone for 2 150 amp ANS fuses. And now the other reason why I did this was that the circuit breaker was getting super hot on its terminals when I was making a coffee. And that to me tells me that there was a bottleneck in the cabling right at that point. So even though it was a 200 amp rated circuit breaker, it certainly didn't like taking 150 amps. So by running 2 cables, 1 to each battery, that meant I could run 2 ANS 150 amp fuses. And that meant that I'm sharing the load between those 2 sets of terminals. And after making 3 or 4 coffees in a row, I found that all of the terminals are cold on the battery, on the fuse blocks, and on the back of the inverter. So I think we're doing quite a good job with that, and I feel a lot better about that as far as the safety goes under the bed of my camper. So 2 4 gauge cables are essentially the same as a 2 gauge, and that means I'm running decent sized cables to the inverter, although I am still getting some voltage drop as you would expect at those sorts of currents. Now, the other problem with rewiring all of the power points to the caravan through the inverter was that the charger is also under the bed, and the charger is plugged into a power point under there, and if I was to turn the inverter on and run all of the power points through the inverter, the battery charger would come on and start trying to charge the batteries off the inverter and create this really funky kind of inefficient loop that would be a disaster. So what I did was I looked at the switchboard and I saw that there were two circuits. There was one circuit for the hot water service, and that's just a 1400 watt Truma Ultra Rapid. Now, I don't even have the 240 volt system for that turned on most of the time. I normally just run it off gas. But what I did was I rewired the projector charger power point to the back of the hot water system power point, and that meant that the charger and the hot water system both ran off the same circuit, which was isolated from the inverter. The inverter has its own 16 amp circuit breaker, and the reason it has a 16 amp circuit breaker is because it's a 4000 watt peak inverter. I wanted to make sure that it was rated to that 15 amps or 16 amps, and I also wanted an RCD from the point of the inverter back to the switchboard, because there were going to be cables running through the caravan and I wanted all of my cables to be protected by RCDs. So the cabling for the inverter goes back to the main switchboard and then through the generator switch and then into the main circuit breaker for the GPOs of the caravan. And that means that all of the power points and the air conditioner are all run from the inverter when it's switched over, bar the hot water system and the charger. And what that means is if I do fire up the generator, I can be charging the batteries while still running off the inverter. And that's really handy because you don't have to be switching it over all the time if you're in a situation where you need to top up the batteries with the generator. So now I've got a system that's got a really good DC setup, and I know that's going to be safe and reliable. And I've also got a really good way of changing all of the power points over to the battery system for off-grid camping. And it is great for coffee. It really is great for making coffees, and I love that, but it's just handy for so many other things. I even charge my electric toothbrush off there. It's just a great setup to have and definitely worthwhile having a look into. Now, if you're interested in having a look for that inverter or you want to buy an inverter yourself, I've put a link in the description to that particular inverter. I've got no affiliation with that brand at all. I don't get any money out of you buying that product. It's just something that I bought and I like. If you need an inverter, it might be a really good option to look at. One of the reasons that I really liked it was because it had a remote control, just like the projector ones, not quite as fancy, but with the inverter under the bed, it's obviously a pain in the neck to have to lift the mattress to turn it on and off all the time. And inverters do use a fair bit of current, you know, an amp or two just idling away even when they're not being used for anything. So you do want to switch that off when you're not using it. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope it's useful for some people. If you've got any comments about my two 4-gauge cables going to the batteries, leave them below. I'm interested to hear any criticisms over it. I mean, I could always change them to just running them in parallel to one battery, but I don't see why I would want to do that. If you like the video, think about hitting the like button. If you like all my videos, subscribe, do us a favor, helps us out a lot. Thanks very much for watching, guys, and I'll see you on the next one.